They're just more kind of optimized for diversification because they're not playing by the rules of the old school media. They're able to have actual sponsorships where they're reading the ads or they're creating creative around the ads, whereas a journalist for a traditional media company would never do this. They're able to develop their own products. You look at things like, the top YouTubers like Emma Chamberlain with Chamberlain Coffee, or Logan Paul with Prime, or Mr. Beast with Feastables. These are products that are kind of everyday products that we need to buy all the time: energy drinks, coffee, and chocolate. But rather than, getting Gatorade as a sponsor, they're saying, okay, we already have this direct relationship with our audience. Why are we then basically renting that audience out to Gatorade when we can develop a competitor to Gatorade and basically market that directly to their audience? So I think you're going to see more interesting business models come out, and they're already coming out with the creator economy that makes it easier for creators to monetize their audiences than your average publisher.
Welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we are deep diving into the stories dominating our world. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Simon Owens, who is a DC area journalist covering the media industry, to Narrative Dive. I've been following his newsletter for quite some time, all of his social posts, and I find him to be an invaluable source of knowledge on the creator economy and the media industry. It's also kind of interesting, Simon, to be a journalist covering the media industry. It feels a bit meta, right? You're sort of looking into your own profession there. But to give you a little bit of background on Simon, his newsletter follows the trends in both the creator economy and traditional media. And he also hosts The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. He got his start as a newspaper reporter covering government and schools in Virginia, and later held positions at PBS's Media Shift and U.S. News and World Report. Simon's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, New York Magazine, Politico, Scientific American, Forbes, Harvard's Nieman Lab, to say a few. And in addition to his journalism work, like many journalists these days who are freelance, Simon has conducted PR, content marketing, and media strategy for dozens of organizations, also including Fortune 100 companies, startups, and trade associations. Welcome, Simon. I'm very happy that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
So I did want to ask you a bit, because your journey from a newspaper, or from a reporter to a newsletter publisher, really mirrors a broader industry transformation. And what I mean by that is there's another journalist named Casey Newton who started a newsletter on Web 2 platforms. And I remember in an interview reading that he never intended to be an entrepreneur or a newsletter or a startup or any of that he had just intended for his career to be as a reporter. But you've kind of had a similar transformation there with yours. And especially this is one that a lot of reporters are taking, especially in the last 10 years. So given the shift, how has the barrier to entry for quality journalism changed?
Yeah, so unlike Casey, I always had kind of an entrepreneurial bent, going back to, when I was in high school. I started getting into these things back then that were called webzines, which were online magazines, but they were so novel that they needed their own name. And even back then in high school, I was trying to start my own webzine with the idea that it would be somehow become a business. And this was late 90s, early 2000s, when, there were very few actual online publications that made any money. Honestly, I kind of was just born too early, so that's why I had to go through such a circuitous path to get here, is because there were, in the 2000s when I first started blogging, there were very few ways to actually make a living as a full-time solo blogger. There were a handful of people like Daring Fireball and Boing Boing and Perez Hilton, a few of these super high tier A-list blogs that were, making a full-time living, but it was nowhere near as common as it's today for, solo creators to basically be able to make content on their own for a living. So that's kind of why it like took me so long to get to where I am. In terms of what was your specific question about the barrier to entry? Sorry.
Yeah, how's that changed how's journalism quality changed with that? Because I know that a lot of reporters are spinning off and doing newsletters now. Does that change, in your opinion, the quality of information that audiences are receiving? Can it enhance it in some way?
Yeah, I think it's the quality of information that's available is much higher now than ever in any part of history. But it's not necessarily because journalists are spinning off. It's because the experts now have, direct access to the audience. So, like, if you, let's say, you're an immigration lawyer who has all this experience on immigration law, and you're seeing what Trump is doing in terms of like, prosecuting and persecuting immigrants in the U.S., like like before, you might have to wait around for like a New York Times reporter or somebody to call you up and interview you. But now all the tools are at your just your use to basically be able to go out and like put your expertise out into the world and like actually be part of the dialogue. And you see that across like thousands upon thousands of niches where people with like very in-depth expertise in certain subjects are able to now go directly to the audience. So I think in some ways our information ecosystem is like more vibrant and rich than ever. Obviously the signal to noise ratio has been getting harder to kind of navigate, so there's more information and there's more that also the same thing applies to bad actors as well. So there's tons of bad information out there. So even though the good information is better, obviously it's being clouded out by bad information. So there's like pros and cons to the current situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I know there's a growing sea of newsletters out there too, and podcasts and content. But the question is, how viable is a lot of this? And is it quality information? How do we tell that? How do we know?
Yeah, I mean that's just comes down to like media literacy, I think. And there's some theories about like millennials being like pretty good at media literacy because we straddle both eras of like pre-internet and post-internet. So we like grew up being skeptical, like being told over and over to be skeptical of anything online, and we kind of like were slowly immersed into this world versus the boomers and older who you never like really learned to navigate that entire information ecosystem, and then the zoomers that like completely grew up fully enmeshed in it. So that's something that I'm not really an expert in, is how do we navigate this? But like, I mean, it's hard for sure.
It's definitely, yeah, very challenging. I've done a few episodes of Narrative Dive in this second season that were with journalist Michelle Mitchell, who produced The Uncondemned, the documentary The Uncondemned, and also with Amanda Knox herself, who was a victim of constant and very hard media attention that attempted to destroy her character. And so it's really become a lot, like a deluge for people. I know that you've had some challenges becoming a media entrepreneur because there's so much content out there. I'm assuming one of your challenges is subscriptions because you do have a blurb on your newsletter about that. But what are some other challenges that you've encountered by going into media entrepreneurship?
Well, it's just like when you're by yourself, it's just so hard to juggle. You just have to juggle everything yourself, like everything from the content creation to the marketing, the audience growth, and then the monetization. And then you could just be pulled like too many different ways at once. And I think I'm pretty decent at like the content creation side and the audience building side. Like I feel like I have my audience, the size and growth where I want it to be, but I've just been like really horrible on the monetization side. And I just haven't been able to create a compelling product, I think, to sell to my subscribers to where I can effectively monetize my content. And some people are really good at also wearing that business hat, but like I feel like I need to continue scaling my audience to the point where even if I'm bad at monetizing, I'm still able to do it enough to like, make a good living, or I need to find like a business partner who can focus 100% on that business side. And it's just really hard because like, let's say you're just doing subscriptions, like anytime you're creating free content, you're helping to grow your audience, but you're not giving people a reason to become a paid subscriber because you're not locking content behind a paywall. But anytime you're creating paid content that's locked behind a paywall, you're not helping to grow your funnel for your audience. And so you're kind of being pulled two different ways of like, you want to grow your audience, but then you also want to put enough stuff behind the paywall to, entice that audience into converting into paid subscriptions. And that's just really hard when it's just you by yourself. So that's why I'm always jealous of a lot of these media startups that have co-founders where two people can kind of like basically build off of each other's strengths and help one another.
Yeah, that's a hugely challenging piece that comes up over and over again is trying to have to wear the business hat, and also how do you monetize content successfully? I know you've seen a lot of examples of how people are doing it, but what is it that really stimulates a person to want to subscribe and be a paying subscriber and continue to support something? I know that's really challenging, and we will definitely come back to that
Yeah.
shortly.
Well, just to give you an example, is like there are two other newsletters that are in my niche that have either similar size audiences to mine or even smaller, and like they're generating upwards of like $500,000 a year. And why are they doing that and I'm not? Is because they're better at like cold emailing like CEOs and CMOs to get them to become sponsors, and they're selling sponsorships at like very high CPM rates, which you can when you have a niche B2B audience. But because I can't stomach the idea of cold emailing a CEO, like that just makes me just like incredibly unhappy just thinking about it. I'm not willing to do that. And so I'm basically foregoing that as an entire revenue stream until like I can find someone who wants to do that for me and is willing to do it for, like a cut of revenue or something like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it is a separate skill and desire, right? Because when you come up as a reporter, as I've done, as you've done, your goal is really just like, I want to tell stories. I want to report. I want to give people useful information that they can use. And then you're suddenly expected to do something like that, like cold pitching and
Yeah.
focusing on all these viewership stats and subscriber stats. And it can be kind of frustrating when you're just wanting to be the reporter. So I know that in the last 2 decades, and I think we're about the same age here, coming up from regular newspaper reporting, where newspapers were a viable, I mean, they're still a viable business in many ways, but it was different in the early 2000s than it is now. And then we went to a lot of online content, then an explosion in short form content like TikTok and Instagram Reels. And now we're heading into some uncharted waters with AI. From your standpoint now, from everything you've been able to glean from those you've been talking to, what does the industry look like another decade down the road given this new technological shift? What does news look like with AI?
So like the news industry, I mean, I think like what AI is doing is it's like basically sweeping up all the commodity information that media companies have wasted a lot of resources creating just so that they can get eyeballs onto an article page so they can monetize it with programmatic ads. Obviously the most famous example is what time is the Super Bowl start, that famous Huffington Post article. And like over the past like 15 years, media companies have like wasted tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars employing young 20 something reporters to write this kind of commoditized news that doesn't really produce any additional value or differentiate them, where they're all just basically trying to eke out and squeeze out a few extra, page views because they, had something go viral on Facebook or take off on Google. And I think that like AI is going to kind of take over a lot of those use cases where when someone is Googling, what time is the Super Bowl, it'll just be an AI generated summary. So like a lot of that commoditized information will be taken over by AI, which means that media companies that want to survive need to be focusing on differentiated content, building their own loyal audiences that are coming specifically to them and that they can monetize more directly, one with more high quality premium advertising, because these are more devoted readers and audiences. So you can convince premium advertisers that this is like a captured audience that you own, but then also like monetizing them directly with their own products like paid subscriptions or even books or even just physical products and other things. So you're going to see much more focus on kind of like in-depth reporting and journalism that's 100% differentiated that's anything else that your competitors are publishing. It's not a coincidence that some of the most successful media companies right now are like the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Atlantic, these companies that are publishing this long form reporting that isn't commoditized, that can't be found anywhere else. And it's really like strengthening their brand, strengthening their connections with their audiences, and successfully converting those audiences into paid subscribers, where those audiences are giving money directly to those companies.
How are creators able to build sustainable businesses from scratch? from what you've seen?
That's a broad question. I mean, so like one that they're usually native on the platforms themselves, so they don't have to they don't have as much pressure to drive traffic back to an owned and operated website like a lot of publishers. So they're native to, like YouTube or TikTok, or even Substack is becoming its own kind of centralized platform. And then two, like they're like they're just more kind of optimized for diversification because they're not playing by the rules of the old school media. They're able to, have actual sponsorships where they're reading the ads or they're creating creative around the ads, whereas a journalist for a traditional media company would never do this. They're able to develop their own products. You look at things like, the top YouTubers like Emma Chamberlain with Chamberlain Coffee, or Logan Paul with Prime, or Mr. Beast with Feastables. These are products that are kind of everyday products that we need to buy all the time: energy drinks, coffee, and chocolate. But rather than, getting Gatorade as a sponsor, they're saying, okay, we already have this direct relationship with our audience. Why are we then basically renting that audience out to Gatorade when we can develop a competitor to Gatorade and basically market that directly to their audience? So I think you're going to see more interesting business models come out, and they're already coming out with the creator economy that makes it easier for creators to monetize their audiences than your average publisher. Like one of my favorite creators to follow is this guy named Nick Bear, or Nick Barr. He's like a fitness influencer, and on his YouTube channel he uses copyrighted music all the time, which means that he's not getting any of the money for the ads that run against his YouTube videos, but he doesn't have to because he's basically a one-man promotion for his nutritional supplements company called BPN, which is a $70 million a year supplements company. So he doesn't care if he gets pennies on the dollar from his YouTube ads, because ultimately he's just trying to drive brand awareness for his supplements company. And that's just a very kind of unique business model that didn't really exist 20, 30 years ago.
No, it didn't. You're right. And then there's a lot of talk about being careful about being on the platforms, because platforms can go away, or they can change their algorithm, or they can adjust settings. And then the next thing you know, you could lose followers. Or if you're running your business model around that, it could be deadly for you in a lot of capacities. So I've seen creators be encouraged to have a blog or a website that's off of YouTube or TikTok or Instagram. But this business model that you're talking about is interesting because they don't really need that if they're just getting sales off of the channels that they're doing. When would you say in this continuum of, we went from newspapers going to online, there was that big online shift, I would say in the early 2000s, when we saw Yahoo News and a lot of web video news content. And then also well, it was Jon Stewart and The Daily Show. That's where we started seeing comedians being almost like news anchors or news reporters in some capacity, to then TikTok and Instagram, and then this creator explosion. At what point in that continuum did the creator explosion really take off in terms of being a viable business model, would you say?
I would say in the early 2010s, when YouTube made the radical decision to start sharing 50% of its ad revenue with the creators that the ads ran against. And that created kind of baseline of revenue for those creators to start justifying putting more resources and time into their videos and making them more fully produced, and then which generated more views, which then generated more ad revenue, which they then reinvested in their businesses. And then, flash forward 10 years and you have people like Mr. Beast that are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So I think that really kind of kicked off the modern day, creator economy. I think the launch of Patreon in 2013 or 2014, whenever it was, that was also a major step forward in terms of allowing the growth for the creator economy, because it became an easy way for creators with not super huge, devoted but not super huge audiences, to go to those audiences and get them to become paid subscribers with recurring payments every month, so they became more predictable. So that allowed some of the smaller creators who didn't have the huge scale to be able to monetize their channels. And then obviously the launch of Substack in 2017, where you connected an email newsletter distribution system with paid subscription, so that you could fully own your audience in a way that you couldn't on YouTube or Instagram or anything like that. And so that you could more directly own that relationship and then pair that with paid subscriptions, I think that was also a huge inflection point that created, like before that, it was mainly video creators that were
Yeah.
succeeding online. And then Substack kind of ushered in this new era where even writers could find like a viable business model for their writing.
Yeah, Substack is an interesting one because it gives you, it's all the built-in payment system. And then, but you also, they claim you also own the data of your subscribers. So you can download the CSV file and everything. But what is interesting is I know the creator situation started with like TikTok videos and Instagram posts and everything, but it's now there are products specifically for creators, like you said, like Substack, that have been built around this new reality. So straddling the fence on traditional media and creator media, what can each learn from each other? What's traditional media really succeeding with that creators maybe aren't, and vice versa?
Like traditional media like creates like an infrastructure that a lot of creators obviously lack, especially like the smaller creators that can't afford to hire people right now. So having someone to help you with kind of like a more centralized, having a salary, having health insurance, being able to help with the marketing and stuff like that, I think that like is something that a lot of creators want. And so that you're starting to see them start to build their own ecosystems for this. For instance, there's this company called Puck that kind of took a lot of like really like high profile journalists who would be perfect for going and launching their own Substacks and stuff like that, but gave them like these and health insurance and marketing support, but also a cut of the revenue that they bring in through their subscriptions, and kind of like married the both sides of those worlds. So that's like, I think of Puck as being as like almost like a hybrid creator economy, traditional media company in that way. In terms of like what the media companies can learn from the creators, like obviously creators have really kind of mastered like native content on actual platforms themselves, where like media companies are still like very obsessed with like driving people back to a website. And then I also think like creators, in terms of like how creative they are in terms of their business model, including like some of the examples I gave you with like Chamberlain Coffee and Prime and Feastables and BPN, is starting to like open publishers' minds about ways that they can diversify their revenue by basically branching off into business models that weren't traditionally under the rubric of media. So like you got like Airmail, for instance, which launched its own brick and mortar kind of store in New York and like Milan and stuff like that. We're starting to see more and more media companies experiment with like launching their own kind of physical products and stuff like that they can market directly to their audiences.
Yeah, you're right. I have noticed Airmail was doing that. I thought that was fascinating. And I mean, the New Yorker sort of did something similar where they give you like a free tote bag for subscribing. Some
Yeah, and
kind
like
of
that tote bag is like a fashion statement. Like
it's
I'm
total
in
that. Yeah,
DC, and like every fifth person who walks down the sidewalk in front of my window right now is carrying that tote bag, which it's just a brilliant piece of marketing, and it's a viable like actual fashion accessory.
I mean, it really does, in terms of brand notoriety, signal other people that I'm as smart as you because I read the New Yorker kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
So New York Times has some branded stuff as well, like coffee mugs or whatever else. Maybe some are unauthorized. Who knows? But yeah, I think there's always going to be that excitement around a media brand to some degree, and you would hopefully want that to be the case. In your knowledge of traditional publishers in the current landscape, which of them have you seen, if you could give some case studies as to who are adopting creator economy principles for their news and their reportage, and which are still fighting them, in your opinion, that you've observed?
Yeah, I mean, like the Washington Post right now is like building out its own kind of what it calls its third newsroom, where it's launching an entire team that is just going to be, I guess, translating the journalism for kind of native platforms. So that's like, that'll be a really interesting experiment to watch. Like, I think the most successful company, and I just did a big 10,000 word article about these guys, is Vox. Their YouTube channel has just been incredible in terms of it being its own kind of native thing that's separate from the Vox website, and has produced some of the best like video journalism ever to appear, on the web or on YouTube. And it's not a coincidence that some of the biggest stars and the independent journalists on YouTube are former Vox employees, like Johnny Harris and Cleo Abram and Joss Fong. So I think that company has been really good about really kind of embracing the creator economy and the native video platforms and producing content specifically for those platforms. Morning Brew, I don't know if you would consider that a traditional media company, but it's owned by Business Insider, which is, owned by a German media conglomerate. They've started to launch their own. They hired this guy named Dan Toomey, who kind of was pitching himself as like Jon Stewart of Gen Z, basically, who started creating like educational sketch comedy for the Morning Brew TikTok channel, and now has spun that off into its own kind of YouTube channel that again does these like funny documentaries that are both educational but also humorous. So I think those are a few examples of media companies kind of embracing at least some of the ethos of the creator economy.
Yeah, that Vox is an excellent example. I did see your article about why these, or how, I forget the title of it. It was something like why the
Best
Vox
journalists on YouTube are all former Vox employees.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And Johnny's stuff is really good. But it is kind of, so Marshall McLuhan, we anyone who's studied communications or journalism knows who the scholar Marshall McLuhan is, who coined the term "the medium is the message." It's one of my favorite phrases. Speaking of mediums, how have platforms like Substack or TikTok or LinkedIn really changed how contents find its audience and the overall message of the content? Because long form and a short form video, two very different pieces of content, right?
Yeah.
And you get much more in-depth information with long form. So how have these really changed the kind of information that audiences are receiving, the quality of it even?
Yeah. So TikTok completely changed the game by like, it was the first social network that just like completely divorced the friend graph from the interest graph. It basically set out with the ethos of, I don't care who your friends are. We're gonna look at what you're consuming, and then we're gonna make a prediction on what you want to consume based on what you've consumed in the past. And so that company really kind of pioneered the For You feed in a way that no other platform that came before it, which was always kind of tied to the Facebook, MySpace ethos of, we think that you should be able to choose who you want to follow and that you'll make your own best decisions. And so that was kind of a revolutionary type of idea that TikTok pioneered. In some ways, it's been good because it's allowed content to find audiences that content wouldn't have been able to find, because there was just so much friction in being able to, like, if you were a small creator, it was really hard to get like a video to go viral, and the TikTok algorithm got really good at plucking these like small obscure videos and then putting it in front of large audiences. So that was kind of the revolutionary thing for TikTok, and how it changed how content finds audiences. Obviously with Substack is kind of like the antidote to the TikTok, is that as the content gets continually divorced from the actual content creator, that content creator loses their own kind of connection to their audience, because it's no longer about following that creator. You're just following the For You feed. So Substack allows you to kind of pull some of that power back and have more ownership of that audience by giving you access to that person's email address so that you can send it directly to their inbox, which is a much more kind of curated feed that people check every single day. So I think the revolutionary thing Substack did was it allowed people to get more ownership over their audiences in a world where the internet was becoming more kind of disassociated from the original. Like, Substack has become kind of like the figurehead of email newsletters, but obviously there are a lot more, there are a lot of email service providers out there, but newsletters, the reason that every publisher is embracing them is because it's allowing publishers and content creators to claw back at least some of that ownership of their own audiences.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's interesting, as a person who predominantly now writes long form journalism, like all of my freelance journalism is long form. And I noticed that there's a new app that's out. I don't remember the name of it. I'll have to look this up. But it actually takes your full article and converts it into some kind of like short form video script that you can then use to make a reel to drive traffic to the longer form content. And I thought, it took us that long to come out with something like that. Shouldn't we have had that, I don't know, 5-6 years ago? It seems like it's a little delayed, because I remember when you were pitching news outlets 10 years ago even, it was a bit annoying, and you had to be a jack of all trades and say, well, I'll provide photos as well, possibly even some audio, this and that. Now it's almost like you have to provide I'll provide a reel as in addition to that. I'll provide photos. It's like it's adding to the amount of things that you have to say that you'll provide an
Mhm.
outlet when you're pitching now. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
you've found that as an issue, but I have. So one of the questions I've been asked in my background as well, because like you, I've worked with Fortune 500s, in content roles and content marketing roles as well over the years, on and off. How do you separate that part of your work from your actual journalism work? That's a big question that I've been asked before. I'm curious to know what your interpretation is.
In terms of like making sure there's no conflicts of interest.
Conflicts of interest and integrity of information.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, disclosure is always an important part of it in the rare cases that you do have to, I think like, avoiding pitching any freelance assignments about clients that you're currently representing, also, a big part of it. I think another big part, like, it's going to be increasingly harder in a world where creators are kind of their own ad pitchmen and like are reading sponsorships. Like, how do you navigate that? And I think every creator, has to figure out what that is. Yeah, it's just hard. I think like the best you can do is just do your best to be open and honest with your audience about what your conflicts of interest are and just try to navigate that on your own. And I think that at the very least they'll appreciate your honesty and know that if there is some kind of conflict, there's probably at least some kind of, bias inherent in that as well. But it's not going to be. I mean, I always thought that like that Chinese firewall was always a little bit overhyped. Like I remember even as a newspaper reporter, my editor, my publisher mentioning in conversation who was an advertiser and who wasn't while we were also talking about stories that we're doing, and it didn't explicitly guide our coverage, but you could tell that it was sort of influencing it. And I'm sure if you're at a much larger institution for the New York Times, maybe there is like it is a true firewall, but like that probably was bleeding over. They were probably bleeding into each other much more than most like journalists would acknowledge even prior to our current age.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Is maybe they're covering corruption in a certain company, and yet the company has an ad on page three
Yeah, yeah.
at the same time. So I don't think this is, to your point, I don't think this is really anything new, but I've
Mhm.
definitely caught some flack about it in the past where I've been told, well, how can you, work for this or that and then also write journalism? And I'm like, it's not the same thing. The company I'm consulting with is totally different than what I'm writing about.
Jack Conti, who founded Patreon, has this great video that everybody should Google. It's something like we've entered a second renaissance, and he the kind of point he makes is there are the most people in human history right now are making a living creating content, and that number will only go up going forward. So that like whatever the ecosystem is now, it's going to be better 5, 10 years from now for creators. And like people talk about a lack supposedly of a creator middle class of like the person who's able to pull in like a steady middle class income as a creator, but that's just going to become more and more possible every year. And there's probably a greater number of people making $50,000 to $100,000 a year as a creator than the year before. So I think that's the trend that's going to be going forward. There's going to be, I think, like basically the traditional media and the creator economy are kind of going to start melding together to where the term like mainstream media only almost starts becoming like an anachronism because people aren't going to really differentiate those two sides because they're basically going to like as the biggest creators get bigger and bigger, they're going to start hiring out their own infrastructure, and then they're eventually going to start looking like traditional media companies. So it's going to really exist more on a spectrum than two separate spheres, separate from each other.
That makes total sense. Yeah. And there's also a lot of speculation that the deluge of AI generated content is going to make everything worse. I mean, I've seen projections that the entire internet is just going to be an information void once the scale at which you can generate AI content. And I'm not going to lie. I mean, I've used AI generated images before, but I've always put that as I've put a caption below that says this is AI generated. What is your take on that? What's coming ahead for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's definitely a problem. It's going to continue being a problem, especially as like these images start like being indexed into like Google Images. Like there are already problems where if you Google like a certain kind of bug, like it's the some of the top photos are AI generated images of that bug, which are incorrect, which what that bug doesn't actually look like. And like if that's like creeping into like, what we consider like actual official repositories of information, that's going to be problematic. I interviewed Tony Stubble, I don't know how to pronounce his name, the current CEO of Medium, about, the AI problem on Medium. And he's like, just because a lot of AI content is being created on Medium doesn't mean that a lot of people are reading it. Like we actually still have human curators that are surfacing the high quality content that's created by humans. So just because there's a ton of AI generated information doesn't mean that all that information is being consumed. Like we shouldn't like confuse audience with just the mere existence of the content. So it doesn't mean that that content's not some of that content is going to find an audience. It definitely will, but a lot of it's just going to be buried in the same place that all spam has always been buried. So we just need to get better and better about like basically finding the signal in the noise. And that's obviously going to become a bigger and bigger problem, but it's something that we need to figure out as a species.
Yes, definitely. And there are also projections that content with a human face is going to become more and more desired because there's just going to be a deluge of AI generated content. So if you can attach it to an actual person, that content's value will increase more. So that's
Yeah.
another.
Although it's getting harder and harder to figure out what's a real person or not.
It is. Yeah, that is very true. I have a friend who's a recruiter who said that the amount of fake AI generated resumes and fake LinkedIn profiles coming his way is overwhelming, which
Yeah, but
is
that's
kind of
written
scary.
content. Like there's now video where it's kind of
Yeah.
hard to figure out if that's a real person on the video or not.
Exactly, yeah, and
Yeah.
and the AI voice training and everything, it really is going to be the next big era for media and content. So we'll have to see what happens. Well, Simon, thank you very much for joining me today and sharing your insights on all the evolutions we have to look forward to of the media industry.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.